Remember that great Spider-Man movie in which Peter Parker grows 8 appendages? No? Well, that's because the strangest Spider-Man movie of all time never ended up getting made. We all know that Sony owns the rights to our favorite web-slinger now, but Spidey made a quick detour, and we'll let you know about the movie that nearly resulted because of it. It's the Spider-Man movie even Marvel superfans will never get to see. Let's take a look back to the humble beginnings of Marvel Comics. Spider-Man has been their most popular superhero pretty much since the moment he showed up in Amazing Fantasy issue 15, and Marvel had no idea he would be so big at the time. Spider-Man co-creator and comics legend Stan Lee always dreamed of seeing his characters on the big screen. He wanted to find just the right buyer for his precious web slinger, but Marvel had other ideas, and settled for the only company who seemed to be interested in paying them to use the character. In the mid-80s, Canon Films purchased the rights to Spider-Man and associated characters from Marvel for the princely sum of $225,500. Once your draw is done dropping at that bargain bin price, let's put it into a little bit of context. Purchasing the rights to a superhero and then sinking money into making a movie about them was a massive risk, but it was one Canon Films had made before. This production company was known for its low-budget films. In the past, they created movies like Missing in Action, Hercules, and American Ninja, so it's not hard to see why Stan Lee was less than thrilled with this arrangement. But Marvel did have something of a safety net in the form of a contract stipulation. Canon Films would have to create a Spider-Man movie by April 1990, or the rights to the character would revert back to Marvel. But Canon Films did fully intend to create an awesome movie about Spider-Man. It's just that their definition of the word awesome is a bit different than what we would use to describe what they came up with. By now, everyone knows the basic story of Spider-Man, even if you've never picked up a comic book in your life. Peter Parker is raised by his Aunt May and Uncle Ben, he gets bitten by a radioactive spider, becomes Spider-Man, and falls deeply in love with Mary Jane. But if you know all that, then you know way more than the team behind Canon Films. Whether they didn't bother to open up a single comic book or just wanted to put their own spin on things, what they set out to do would have rendered the Spider-Man franchise completely unrecognizable from what it is today. Let's start out with their casting calls. So who wants to guess who Canon Films chose to be their Peter Parker? If you guessed Tom Cruise, you're right. That might seem pretty shocking now, but remember, this casting call took place back in the 80s. Cruise was in his 20s and had just done movies like Risky Business and All the Right Moves. He was a star, but nowhere near the Hollywood icon that he is today. So casting him as Peter Parker wasn't outside of the realm of possibility, and in fact, it was one of the first things Canon Films decided on when they began the project. Although we don't know if Cruise would have actually accepted the part, it's pretty crazy to imagine the impact this film could have had on his career if it ever got made. Since Canon Films had decided on who they wanted to play their hero, they of course needed someone to play the main villain. Today, we take for granted that many stereotypical nerdy things like comic books and video games are pretty mainstream, but for a long time, it was really a struggle to bring beloved characters into different mediums and have them be accepted. One example of this was definitely the Super Mario Bros. Movie. In the movie, Mario himself was played by legendary actor Bob Hoskins, who counts Who Framed Roger Rabbit, The Long Good Friday, and Mona Lisa among his acting credits. While many people remember the Super Mario Bros. Movie with nostalgia, it was an absolute mess of a film, and Hoskins agreed. He called it the worst thing he ever did, and said working on it was an absolute nightmare. So we aren't sure just how thrilled he would have been about appearing in a superhero movie, but he was someone Canon Films desperately wanted for the project. They wanted Peter Parker, played by Tom Cruise, to face off against a Dr. Octopus played by Bob Hoskins. Canon Films had one more big-name actor in mind, and it was none other than movie icon Lauren Bacall. She had starred in some massive classic hits, including Key Largo, The Big Sleep, and How to Marry a Millionaire. And now Canon Films wanted her to play Aunt May. At the time, Bacall was taking a break from acting following poor reviews for the movie The Fan, so Canon Films hoped that they'd be able to persuade her to return to acting in order to appear in their superhero movie. Now that we've assembled Canon's cast of characters, let's talk about the plot of the movie. To start things off, forget everything you know about Spider-Man, and you're pretty much on the same level as whoever came up with this movie. The first version of the script involved a mad scientist by the name of Dr. Zork. Peter Parker was taking ID photos for the doctor's company when Zork exposed him to a massive dose of radiation, turning him into Spider-Man. This origin story change might not be such a big deal, except for the fact that this version of Spider-Man was really more of a man-spider and had 8 appendages. Yikes! Needless to say, when Stan Lee got a hold of the script, he was mortified and begged the studio to try again. Yes, as strange as it may sound, Stan Lee was very involved with the film. As much as he had hoped for a bigger studio, he loved the idea of a Spider-Man movie. He even had a role in mind for himself, and it wasn't a mere cameo. Stan Lee wanted to appear in the film as J. Jonah Jameson, Spider-Man's boss at the Daily Bugle. This is probably the one thing which makes us a little bit sad the movie never ended up getting made, because this would have been amazing. Although he never got to play the part of J. Jonah Jameson, Stan Lee did step up to help out with the script. Overall, they ended up with a plot which was overall kind of like Spider-Man 2, directed by Sam Raimi. In the story, Otto Octavius, college professor and mentor to Peter Parker, was in an accident which turned him into Dr. Octopus, and also somehow turned Peter into Spider-Man. By the end of the movie, Dr. Octopus would attempt to recreate his anti-gravity experiment, and Spider-Man would have to stop him. But of course, there's a lot more weirdness they tried to pack in. In the canon version of the film, Dr. Octopus was called Professor Octopus, which isn't that strange of a name change, except Professor Octopus called his mechanical arms Waldos, and we're not sure what to say about that other than why. Professor Octopus also had an assistant/sidekick, although his role wasn't very clearly defined in the script. One thing the script was crystal clear on, however, was that the guy's name was Wiener, like hot dog, Wiener. Yeah, oh, and of course, Wiener had a catchphrase truly befitting of his position, "Okie dokie." As if this whole thing wasn't crazy enough, Canon Films hit a serious snag when it came to getting this movie made. They missed a payment to Marvel, causing them to temporarily lose the rights to the movie and delaying production considerably. To add to this situation, the budget on the movie got slashed from $15 million to $10 million, putting them even further behind. But in 1988, Canon Films got back to work on the project, and it wasn't the only movie on their minds. The team was working on Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, and the He-Man movie Masters of the Universe. So with a reduced budget, a busy schedule, and a revolving door of employees, the studio decided the script needed a major rewrite. Now they were hoping to get the film in theaters by December 1989. They scrapped Dr. Octopus and all of his Waldos and decided to have Spider-Man's enemy of the movie be a mad scientist who's also a vampire. No. Really, if you're a comic book fan, you may be thinking of Morbius, the living vampire. In the comics, Dr. Michael Morbius goes through a similar transition. So although it may sound crazy at first, there was precedence for Spider-Man interacting with a vampire. However, this vampire character was definitely not Morbius, the living vampire, just a different scientist/vampire. But the film's current director decided to go in yet another direction for the villain and wanted the Lizard to show up instead. However, he didn't get his way because there was no way their budget would have allowed them to pull off the character. Creating a vampire is way more cost-effective than trying to rig up a giant lizard man, let alone if you want it to look halfway decent. The director then had an idea to maximize their dwindling budget and race against the clock by filming 2 movies at the same time. The idea was to work on both Spider-Man and Masters of the Universe 2 at the same time, using the same sets. Was he trying to create his own cinematic universe and actually way ahead of his time? We may never know because Canon Films nixed the idea pretty much immediately. By now, the dwindling budget of this movie was down to about $5 million, but it was too late. Superman 4 was a massive failure, and it was just one of many. The studio was $250 million in debt, and there was no way they would be able to make the Spider-Man movie, let alone get it done before the 1990 deadline. Canon Films was taken over by Path Communications. who got to work restructuring the studio's considerable debt, and that's when legendary director James Cameron stepped in. Menachem Golan, one of the men behind Cannon Films, negotiated a deal to have Spider-Man remade with James Cameron as writer and director. Unsurprisingly, Cameron had a grandiose vision for the project and the character of Spider-Man. He came up with the idea of having the webbing be an organic part of Peter Parker's body, and created a very adult, edgy version of Spider-Man. But his script would never end up seeing the light of day. Golan was determined to be a part of the Spider-Man movie, and he and Cameron didn't quite see eye to eye on the project. We're assuming Cameron didn't include enough arms in the new project. Cameron ended up dropping the project, and by then the clock had run out. Spider-Man's rights reverted back to Marvel, who then went on to sell them to Sony for $7 million. Of course, they also offered Sony the Avengers, Black Panther, and many others for $25 million, which they declined. But we're not talking about Sony's movie-making mistakes today. In the aftermath of Cannon Films, Sony's treatment of the Spider-Man franchise looks positively masterful. How do you think the Cannon Films version of Spider-Man would have turned out? Which elements would you love to have seen on the big screen? Tell us what you would want to see in the comments section below. And then click on the subscribe button for more videos from us here at CBR. Thanks for watching.